Have you ever noticed how some people manage to completely control the dynamics of any relationship without even seeming to try? They don't yell, they don't beg, they don't make a scene. In fact, they do the exact opposite. They control the mind game in a way that most people don't even realize is happening. And today, using Carl Jung's deep psychology, you'll discover exactly how to master this skill that can transform all your relationships forever. Most people believe that controlling a relationship means controlling the other person. This is the greatest illusion in human psychology. Carl Jung discovered something revolutionary. When you try to directly control someone's behavior, you automatically put yourself in a position of psychological weakness. Why? Because you are reacting, not acting. Let me give you an example that will clarify all this. Imagine a relationship where one person is constantly asking, "Where are you? Who are you with? Why didn't you answer me?" This person believes they are exercising control, but in fact, they are revealing their own insecurity and emotional dependence. Jung observed that this type of behavior creates exactly the opposite result of what the person desires. When you show neediness, you lose power. When you pursue, you become less attractive. When you try to control, you reveal that you have no control. Think of the people you know who are always trying to manipulate others through emotional blackmail, drama, or constant pressure. These people may achieve temporary results, but they never have true power. They are slaves to the reactions of others. Have you ever been in a situation where the more you tried to convince someone of something, the more resistance that person offered? This is no coincidence. It is pure psychology. Carl Jung called this the power complex, when our need to control others reveals our own lack of internal control. But what if I told you that there is a way to control any relational dynamic without even trying to control the other person? Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming completely psychologically independent. And when you master this, something almost magical happens. People start behaving completely differently around you without you doing anything at all. They start seeking your approval. They start valuing your presence. They start respecting your decisions. And this happens because you have activated a psychological principle that few people know about. Carl Jung had a fascinating theory about psychic energy. He believed that each person has a limited amount of mental and emotional energy, what he called psychic libido. Here's what most people don't understand. Your psychic energy is the most valuable resource you have. It's more valuable than your time, your money, or even your physical attention. And there is an immutable psychological rule. People always value more what is difficult to obtain. Imagine two people in a relationship. The first is always available, always trying to please, always giving their emotional energy away for free. They respond to messages immediately, cancel their plans to be with the other person, and constantly seek validation. The second person is selective, conscious of where they invest their energy, and is not always emotionally connected. They have their own interests, their own goals, and are not constantly available for drama or validation. Which of these two people do you think has more power in the relationship dynamic? The answer is obvious, but the reason behind it is profound. When you control your psychic energy, you control the value people place on your presence. Jung discovered that people unconsciously project greater value onto those who are not constantly emotionally available. It's not cruelty, it's pure psychology. Jung observed this in his own therapeutic relationships. The patients who benefited most were those he did not try to save or control. When he maintained clear professional boundaries, when he was not emotionally dependent on the results, patients naturally developed more respect and trust. This works because when you are not desperate for attention or validation, you emit a completely different psychological frequency. People sense this unconsciously. Now we come to the heart of Jung's theory on relationships, the concept of psychological projection. Projection is when we unconsciously attribute characteristics, feelings, or motivations to other people that actually exist within ourselves. But Jung discovered something even deeper. People not only project their own characteristics onto others, they also project what they most desire or admire. Let me give you an example that will completely change how you view relationships. When you are not constantly emotionally available, when you are not always seeking validation, people begin to project qualities such as mystery, confidence, and independence onto you. They begin to think, why doesn't this person need me as much as I need them? What do they have that I don't? They must be special in some way. This is no coincidence. It's how the human psyche works. Jung discovered that we unconsciously attribute strength and value to those who don't seem to need us emotionally. Think of someone you know who rarely opens up emotionally or who isn't always needy for validation. How do you feel about that person? There's probably a certain amount of respect, curiosity, or even admiration. Now, think of someone who is always sharing their problems, always needing approval, always emotionally dependent. How do you feel about that person? There is probably compassion, but not necessarily respect or admiration. Jung called this a projected inferiority complex. When people feel inferior, they automatically elevate those who don't seem to need the same emotional needs. This is what Jung called psychological autonomy. When you become emotionally independent, you automatically become more attractive and powerful in any relationship. But how do you develop this autonomy without becoming cold or disconnected? The answer lies in the next revolutionary concept Jung discovered. Carl Jung identified one of the most important discoveries in psychology: the difference between the persona, the mask we show to the world, and the self, who we really are. The persona is like a suit we wear to adapt to different social situations. At work, you have one persona. With friends, you have another. With family, yet another. The problem arises when you identify completely with these masks and lose touch with your authentic self. Most people live completely identified with their persona. They are slaves to the image they want to project, and this makes them predictable, manipulable, and weak in relationships. Do you know people who completely change their personality depending on who is around? Who always try to impress, always want to be accepted, are always afraid to show vulnerability? These people are living a completely reactive life. They have no power because they don't know who they really are. Jung had a patient who was completely different at work, at home, and with friends. He was exhausted trying to maintain all these masks. When Jung helped him find his authentic self, something incredible happened. He became more magnetic in all situations. Jung discovered that when you are connected to your authentic self, when you know who you are, regardless of the approval of others, you develop a magnetic presence that is impossible to fake. Here's the secret. People who control the mental game in relationships have learned to use their persona consciously, as a tool, not as an identity. They can be charming when they want to be, distant when they need to be, vulnerable when they choose to be. But all of this comes from a conscious choice, not an emotional need. It's like being an actor who is conscious of their own performance. You can play different roles, but you always know who you are beneath the mask. When you master this skill, you are no longer reacting to relationship dynamics. You are creating them. But there is an even deeper and more disturbing aspect of human psychology that Jung discovered. Jung also discovered something disturbing about human nature. We all have a shadow, the repressed part of our personality that contains everything we deny about ourselves. The shadow isn't necessarily bad. It simply contains all the parts of us that have been rejected, suppressed, or deemed unacceptable by society. For example, if you were taught that anger is always bad, your ability to be assertive may be in your shadow. If you were taught that selfishness is always wrong, your ability to set boundaries may be in your shadow. Here's what most people don't know. When you consciously integrate your shadow, you develop a psychological presence that is impossible to ignore. Jung observed that the most magnetic and powerful people are not those who completely repress their shadow, but those who consciously integrate it. People who control relationships are not just nice all the time. They are able to be assertive, to set boundaries, to say no when necessary. They have integrated both their light and their shadow. They can be kind and firm, compassionate and assertive, vulnerable and strong. This complexity is what makes them fascinating and respected. Jung had a patient who was extremely passive in all her relationships. She could never say no, never expressed her needs, and constantly felt exploited. When Jung helped her integrate her shadow, the part of her that was capable of anger, assertiveness, and boundaries, she was completely transformed. Her relationships improved dramatically because people finally began to respect her. Jung believed that true psychological maturity comes when you stop trying to be perfect and accept the full complexity of your personality. When you do this, you develop what Jung called psychological integrity, an authenticity that is simultaneously attractive and intimidating. People sense this unconsciously. They realize that you are not trying to impress anyone, that you are not afraid of being rejected, that you are comfortable with all aspects of who you are. And this creates a psychological dynamic where people naturally want your approval, your attention, your energy, because they feel that you don't need them, but choose to be with them. Let's recap the transformative journey you've just been on. First, you discovered that true control in relationships doesn't come from manipulating others, but from mastering yourself. When you stop trying to control other people's reactions, you automatically become more powerful. Second, you learned that your psychic energy is your most valuable resource. When you treat it as such, being selective about where and how you invest it, people automatically value it more. Third, you understood how projection works. When you develop psychological autonomy, people project positive qualities onto you without you having to do anything. Fourth, you have discovered the difference between living through your persona and living through your authentic self. When you wear your mask consciously, you control the narrative. And finally, you have learned about shadow integration, how accepting all aspects of your personality makes you magnetic and respected. Here are 5 concrete steps for you to start applying this today. Energy awareness. Before reacting emotionally to any situation, ask yourself, does this person or situation deserve my psychic energy right now? Emotional autonomy. Practice not needing validation from others. Make at least one decision a day based solely on what you want, not what others expect. Shadow integration. Accept that you are not perfect. Allow yourself to be assertive, set boundaries, and say no when necessary. Conscious use of persona. Practice being authentic while adapting your presentation to the context. Be strategic, not reactive. Observation of projection. Notice how people react differently when you are not desperate for their approval. If this video resonated with you, if you are ready to stop being controlled by the dynamics of others and start creating your own rules, write in the comments, "I control my mental game." Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell, because the journey to true psychological power is just beginning. Remember, in a world full of people trying to control each other, the one who controls himself is king. And now you have the keys to the kingdom.